There was time now. There was all the time I needed. That's not fair.
I love The Twilight Zone. Despite never really being a huge fan of horror or sci-fi, I've always found myself weirdly drawn to this surreal anthology-style show from the 50s. It's deeply unnerving yet layered, thought-provoking, and boring at times. Plus, I think we can all agree that Rod Serling, the creator and host of the show, was just a stone-cold hottie.
A strange intersection in a shadowland called the Twilight Zone.
The Twilight Zone dissected man's fears and fallacies through supernatural and absurd scenarios. And I think the best Twilight Zone property to exemplify this theme is not any individual episode, but the Twilight Zone movie. So today, let me tell you the story of how one man's hubris turned into another man's demise during the production of
The Twilight Zone.
Our story begins with Steven Spielberg in 1981, 17 years after the final episode of The Twilight Zone aired. Spielberg decided that the world needed to experience the show again, but not on TV. This time, he wanted them to see it on the big screen. So he wanted to make a movie of The Twilight Zone. He wanted to make the Twilight Zone movie. To carry out his vision, Spielberg brought his friend and director John Landis to the project. Now, John Landis wasn't as highly regarded as Steven Spielberg. I mean, he had stuff like Animal House and American Werewolf from London under his belt, but he wasn't exactly an Oscar baby. However, when Landis lacked an Oscar buzz, he made up for it making movies that just printed money. The Twilight Zone movie mimicked the anthology style of the original series, with 4 short films bookended by an uninspired prologue and epilogue featuring Dan Aykroyd and Albert Brooks. 3 of the featured pieces were modern remakes of classic Twilight Zone episodes, namely Kick the Can, It's a Good Life, and Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. The 4th one, titled Time Out, was an original script written and directed by John Landis. And in this segment is where we find the horrors within the Twilight Zone movie production. Time Out is the story of a racist man named Bill Connor thrown back in time to live as a Jew during Nazi Germany, a black man at a KKK meeting, and a Vietnamese man being hunted by American soldiers during the Vietnam War. Vic Morrow, an actor commonly typecast to play a villain back in those days, was hired to play Connor.
I'll tell you something else. Live not more than 6 blocks from my house.
Language.
Alright, so now that Landis had his star and his story, it was time for him to get approval from the Warner Brothers executives. Upon looking at the script and the casting decision, the higher-ups decided to reject the piece. Apparently, a story about an overt bigot played by a known grumpy man thrown back to the worst parts of history was not going to be likable enough for audiences. Landis' solution for this was to write an entirely new scene for the movie. In this new scene, Morrow, who was playing Connor as we've already established, would save 2 Vietnamese children from a village being bombed by American soldiers. A save the cat moment, if you will. Something to make Connor look less like a flaming asshole. Landis ran into his next issue when he was trying to cast the children for the squeezed-in segment. The Twilight Zone casting agents refused to hire kids for 2 reasons. 1, Landis wanted to film these scenes late at night, which is against California child labor laws. And 2, the idea of putting kids within blasting distance of explosives seemed, a little too dangerous. Even for the 80s. So to get his child stars, Landis had to sneak around, essentially. Instead of just making the scene a little bit more kid-friendly and hiring them through the proper channels, Landis decided to ask his associate producer to illegally hire 2 non-union Asian children. Eventually, they casted 7-year-old Micah Din Lee and 6-year-old Rinny Shin-yi Chen, both of which were children of friends of friends of friends of the associate producer. Landis paid them under the table $500 a day from petty cash. On set, the families of these children were instructed to hide them if they ran into the fire safety officer, because the fire safety officer had the authority to shut down the entire production if he found out that children were illegally hired to work on this, needless to say, unsafe shoot. This all seems pretty sketchy already, right? Well, we haven't even gotten to principal photography yet. July 22nd, 1982. The first day of shooting for the village rescue scene. The crew were already expressing their concerns about how dangerous they felt it was to have kids so close to pyrotechnics and helicopters. One of the assistant directors even questioned why they needed to film real children. Why couldn't they just use dummies or stuntmen? Well, apparently Landis' answer was that kids added an air of realism. Anything else would look phony. So moving on to the next day, July 23rd, 1982, the second shoot day of the village rescue scene.
Videotape has recorded for posterity the events which unfolded at 2:20 in the morning on July the 23rd, 1982.
Landis and his crew are filming Vic Morrow running through waist-deep water, Micah in one arm, Renee in the other, and being chased by active helicopters while explosions are going off around them everywhere. It's 3 a.m., there's fire essentially just spouting out wherever it wants to spout out, and Landis is yelling for the helicopter pilot to fly lower. The pilot told Landis that he couldn't get any lower than he was, but Landis insisted that he wanted him closer in the shot. The pilot argued, Landis shouted at him through a megaphone, and apparently the man with a megaphone won because the pilot went closer. If this description is making you nervous at all, it should, because this is when shit's about to get real. An ill-timed and massive fireball clips the back of the helicopter just as it's flying over Vic Morrow and the two kids. At that point, Morrow accidentally drops Renee in the water and is running back to go get her. The helicopter then fully loses control and crashes on top of the two kids and Morrow.
The third blast blew our tail prop off, and it was all over. We just started spinning and went around in circles about 1.5 times or something and crashed into the riverbed. And on our way down is when we hit the actors.
The body of the craft crushed Renee, while the blades of the helicopter decapitated Morrow and Micah. Everyone was in shock when Landis nonchalantly shouted out, "That's a wrap." We can only hope that he didn't realize that 3 people were just mutilated to death in front of them. The families of Vic Morrow, Micah Dinley, and Renee Shin-yi Chen sued Landis, Spielberg, Warner Brothers, and several other parties involved. These cases were all settled out of court, but the state trials took a little bit longer. In 1986, 4 years after the incident, Landis was charged with multiple counts of manslaughter.
In the dock are the director John Landis and 4 associates, all charged with the involuntary manslaughter 4 years ago of 3 actors, including Vic Morrow, in an accident that took place during the filming of Twilight Zone.
3 counts were filed under grossly negligent acts, and 2 counts were filed under the legal theory that death under unlawful circumstances constitutes manslaughter. The unlawful acts in this case were the hiring of the 2 children illegally.
As far as I know, isn't this trial unprecedented in this sort of thing, and people being held accountable for the deaths of performers?
I think it's the first time.
Yeah.
That I know.
That a director is this, especially.
Landis' defense included gems like, nobody warned him the shoot would be that dangerous. It was the helicopter pilot and pyrotechnic guy's fault. And the actors shouldn't have done the scene if they knew it was going to be that risky. With the help of his lawyer, James Neal, Landis was acquitted. And fun fact, Neal was the lawyer that got Elvis's doctor off for overprescribing Elvis the medication that killed him. Anyway, going back to the Twilight Zone movie, it came out in 1983 with not very good reviews. Many critics slammed Landis' timeout segment for being overly predictable and slow-paced. Richard Caloris from The Times ranted that, "The story hardly looks worth shooting, let alone dying for." The children weren't even shown in the final cut. Instead, the short reverted back to the original story that Landis wrote. The one with Morrow being an unlikable jerk with no redeemable characteristics.
I'm trying to tell you that I'm better than a Jew. I'm better than some I'm better than some because I'm an American!
There was no trace of the incident that occurred. No kids, no helicopters, no rescue, and no crash. If you're wondering what happened to Landis, he actually got work after the making of the Twilight Zone movie, up until the trial for the movie. He directed Trading Places, Into the Night, and Michael Jackson's Thriller music video. However, the amount of work he got dramatically reduced after the release of the book Outrageous Conduct by Stephen Farber. The novel detailed Landis' behavior during the making of the Twilight Zone movie and before and during the helicopter crash incident. Now, as an industry pariah, Landis directs and produces TV commercials and small-scale shows. There is no good that came from the story I just told you. It's one we've heard many times before. Man flies too close to the sun, man gets burnt. However, in this version, the sacrifice wasn't Icarus. It was the people that trusted him, who believed in him, who he was looking after. Yes, movie studios have since tightened their safety regulations and expanded their safety efforts, But that won't bring back Vic, Micah, or Renee. And it certainly won't console their perpetually grieving families. This helicopter massacre could have been easily avoided with even the slightest bit of empathy, reasoning, and humility. A sad but all too real truth while making
The Twilight Zone
movie. And that is the story of one of the worst tragedies in the movie industry. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.